Yesterday, USAID Administrator Samantha Power announced over $720 million in new funding to intensify the fight against COVID-19 abroad, respond to humanitarian crises exacerbated by COVID-19, and support a global recovery while preparing for future pandemic threats. This announcement caps the end of her trip to Ethiopia, where she emphasized the urgent need for full and unhindered humanitarian access in Ethiopia's Tigray region, and reiterated the U.S. commitment to support African countries in their response to the COVID-19 pandemic. During her visit, the administrator toured USAID-supported food commodities warehouse and a COVID treatment center, and joined humanitarian partners to discuss the response to efforts in Tigray. In the lead-up to the administrator's travel, the U.S. announced more than $149 million in additional humanitarian assistance to help people affected by the ongoing conflict in Tigray. Administrator Power met with Dr. John Inka Asang, director of the African Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, to discuss the expansion of the U.S. government partnership. The administrator also held substantive, frank discussions with Ethiopia's Minister of Peace, Mufariat Kamil, and separately with the chairman of the Ethiopian Red Cross. She later had the chance to meet with young civil society leaders to discuss ethnic conflict, Tigray, and the future of the country, among other issues. Before her visit to Ethiopia, Administrator Power spent 4 days in Sudan, where she met with Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok, Sovereign Council Chairman Lieutenant General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, Foreign Minister Dr. Miriam al-Mahdi, and other transitional government leaders, as well as citizens who led the protests that resulted in former dictator Omar al-Bashir's overthrow in 2019. In a speech to students, academics, and democracy activists at the University of Khartoum earlier this week on August 3rd, Administrator Power announced an additional $4.3 million to support electoral processes in Sudan, making a total of $12 million. USAID has committed in election-related assistance as Sudan prepares for democratic elections in 2024. She spoke with displaced communities in Darfur and Ethiopian refugees who fled the harrowing conflict in Tigray to eastern Sudan, and saw some of the USAID programs that are providing them with life-saving assistance.
Okay.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Ned. My name is Mesfin from TG Ethiopian Broadcasting. I have two questions for you. Please be patient. And Ned, these questions are not only mine. They are also questions of millions and millions of Ethiopians around the globe. 2 weeks ago, when I got a chance to ask Jen Psaki a question at her White House press briefing, she responded, I quote, I would point you to State Department. I know my colleague Ned Price is briefing later this afternoon and giving you more details on what our work is. Since this press briefing is a pooled press coverage, I was not able to come soon to ask you this question. And I'm glad I'm here today, Ned, and here is a question I asked Jen Psaki, and I want you to answer it for me. The United States and other countries have been supporting and into the fighting in the Tigray region. And at the first step, as you know, to end the fighting, the government of Ethiopia declared a unilateral ceasefire and pulled out the troops from the Tigray region. But TPLF, the Tigray Liberation Front, rejected the ceasefire, calling it a sick joke. And the TPLF continued the war, especially by deploying child soldiers in this conflict. And if the war continues, thousands and thousands of people will die. Ned, what is the Biden's administration statement on TPLF's refusal to accept the ceasefire and the use of children as soldiers? Thank you.
Well, thank you for that question. There are a couple pieces there. One, I want to be very clear on these allegations that the TPLF is recruiting child soldiers. We are very much concerned by these reports. We take these allegations very seriously. We reiterate our call for all parties to adhere strictly to international humanitarian law, and for those responsible for violations of international humanitarian law and human rights abuses to be held accountable. When it comes to the broader conflict, we have made this point before, but again, it bears repeating. We call on the TPLF We call on the Amhara regional forces. We call on the Eritrean Defense Forces, on the Ethiopian National Defense Forces, and associated regional militias to end this crisis and to move towards a negotiated ceasefire. In our mind, this is what is most important: ending the conflict, moving toward that negotiated ceasefire, and providing the level of humanitarian access that the people in Tigray need, of which they are in dire need. The Ethiopian government and the TPLF need to begin ceasefire negotiations immediately and without preconditions. This should lead to a broader dialogue to find a durable political solution to this conflict. We strongly condemn any attacks that have been or may be directed against civilians in the Tigray region, regardless of the actor, whether it's organized by military or security forces or rogue elements operating there. Those who commit such acts, as I said before, must be held accountable. And we call on all parties to condemn such acts and do everything in their power to stop them. We're particularly concerned by credible reports that armed forces affiliated with the TPLF and the Tigrayan militias have engaged in attacks against Eritrean refugees in the region. Such conduct is reprehensible. It must cease. It must come to an immediate halt. Those responsible, again, should be held responsible and accountable for their actions. We're equally concerned by reports of Ethiopian security force harassment and arbitrary detention of ethnic Tigrayans in regions of Ethiopia beyond Tigray. And security force harassment and detention on the basis of ethnicity is unacceptable. We call on all parties to cease such activities and to respect human rights and the rule of law. We further call on all armed actors to comply with international humanitarian law, including the obligations regarding the protection of civilians. As we consistently stated, any effort to change Ethiopia's internal boundaries by force is unacceptable. Any issue of national importance is an issue for the Ethiopian people to decide through consensual dialogue and democratic processes, not through violence. And that is why we have put such a priority on this negotiated ceasefire. That is what we have continued to urge, urging the parties to come together immediately without preconditions, just as we push for increased humanitarian access so that the long-suffering people of Tigray can be in receipt of that relief.
The TPLF refuses the ceasefire and to accept the ceasefire, and it advances its forces to Amhara and regional Amhara and Afar regions. So what do you say when the TPLF refuses a ceasefire? How can there will be negotiation?
Well, we have seen these reports of the expansion of the fighting. The expansion of the fighting in Tigray are concerning. The reports of the expansion of the fighting in Tigray are concerning. And it's concerning because it will only lead to more suffering and to more death. That is why we continue to say that all parties to the conflict should immediately agree to an end to the violence and to begin in earnest negotiations and political dialogue. Armed actors in Tigray and Amhara, and the government of Ethiopia need to reach an agreement that allows the ceasefire to include all parties and facilitates, as I said before, delivery of humanitarian access. The government of Eritrea, for its part, must withdraw its forces consistent with commitments by both Ethiopia and Eritrea. Please.
My final question is, during your press briefing, you often call TPLF's forces military forces. As you know, TPLF is an opposition and armed resistance to the established Ethiopian government, whether you like it or not, which makes if the TPLF is against the government, then it makes it rebel force. Even though my English is second language, military is a name given to the armed forces of a country. So, why are you calling TPLF forces military whenever you give the press briefing? The military is for, as I said, is for given for a country forces, not just for rebel forces. So
the point we've been making, and what in part makes this conflict so concerning, is the fact that a range of actors are engaged in violence and in some cases in these reported atrocities. There are military actors involved, there are irregular forces involved, there are militias involved, there are rogue actors involved. What we have been pushing for is for the Ethiopian government and the TPLF to begin these ceasefire negotiations immediately and without preconditions, just as we call for all armed actors in this conflict. And unfortunately, there are many, to cease the violence, to cease the killing, and to respect the international legal obligations to which they're subject.